The idea of a PhD program is to bring people to such a level of understanding in a field that they can become participants in the creation of the knowledge of that field. And that business of participating in the creation of knowledge it depends on research. Without research, you really don't push the frontiers of a field. Now you can, it's a little bit like whittling. You can keep whittling until you get the object shaped the way you want it. But if you really want to learn anything about the craftsmanship of ideas, you really need to do some research that helps to extend and deepen the understanding of what the phenomena are that you're playing with. Now, that idea of research is misunderstood in many cases, and some would argue that it's not a misunderstanding, it's just a difference of opinion. But let me call it the way I see it. I think some institutions put their emphasis on paper writing and their emphasis on research as if it were really research, when all they're doing is rewriting and producing new books based on old ideas. That does not extend the knowledge in a field. Without naming the fields where that's a problem, it is clearly a big problem in the academic world, that in some fields, some disciplines, there's just very little done that truly expands on and deepens the ideas on which that field is built. Now, I believe, from my experience at Michigan State and University of Florida, that a university of the first order has a responsibility of being a place where people go to extend the knowledge in the field. Now, when you take a field like Christian education, for example, what exactly is there to extend in that field? Don't we know everything there is to know about Christian education? Now, aside from the practical, tasky stuff of the messing around with methodologies, the fact is that there really aren't an awful lot of new ideas that float around and that can be recognized as a valid extension of the field. And that's a pity, because heaven knows we don't know all there is to know about Christian education. We don't know all there is to know about education. And most particularly, we don't know all there is to know about Christian education. Now, recognizing that conceptually, I say, okay, now if I'm going to go and work in a place like Trinity and help them build a program that is a PhD program for people who are going to extend knowledge in the field, I've got to help them find ways to get hold of that field in such a way that they can, in fact, engage in the building of the knowledge base. Now, that responsibility of working with people so that they can become involved in the extending of that knowledge base is exactly how you answer the question you asked. And I felt that that was an absolute necessity, and it never occurred to me that it wasn't. And nobody ever suggested to me that that was anything less than my job. So I immediately asked the question, what would research in this field look like? And one of the things we know is that research divides fairly neatly into two classes. Some research, and I'm talking about empirical research, is primarily experimental. Other research is primarily investigative and exploratory. The exploratory and investigative kinds of things generally are non-quantitative. They are qualitative, or they are substantial in idea, but not necessarily ideas that can be can result in data that can be counted. Sad to say that one of the things that happens in fields fields like missiology is that people are so eager to get quantitative about their research that they start counting silly things. And so you count the number of people who come to church. You count the number of people who don't come to church. You do all sorts of things just to count and get numbers and play around with numbers. That kind of emphasis on playing around with numbers is abhorrent to me. I despise it, because playing around with numbers is not a good way to push forward the field, the frontiers of a field. I argue instead that the place for quantitative research, the handling of numbers, the counting of things, the calculating of statistical relationships between those sets of numbers, that is a disciplined task that requires a great deal of knowledge about what is already there before you start counting it. In other words, you definitely have to have a qualitative stage that's well developed in any field before you can get to the quantitative work. And that has not been true in a field like Christian education. The quantitative work always must follow the qualitative work. And the qualitative work is where we focus our degrees at Trinity, because the field of Christian education is still starving for good qualitative studies. Once we get the qualitative studies in place, then we can start playing around the edges and discover the ways in which we can turn this into quantitations. I believe that if the field of missiology had understood this, they wouldn't be messing around with so much demographic stuff. They do the demographic stuff simply because they know that there are people out there that can be counted. And you can ask all kinds of quantitative questions of those people. But does it really give you any insights that suggest real frontier of understanding among the practitioners of those fields? No, I don't think so. Now, that's, in a nutshell, where we have come from and where we're going. To review, my commitments are to use the PhD program as a place to train those who will be the leader, inventors, discoverers of the nuances of the field. In order that that can happen, they need a foundation in the qualitative studies, the study of the characteristics, the study of the variable possibilities, the study of the interrelationship hypotheses. Then they need to go into a quantitative period or emphasis that studies the quantitative analysis of those hypotheses, and then make declarations about what is and what isn't. And until we get those declarations of what is and what isn't, we really haven't done all the job that is required in doing good research. And I think that this then raises a serious question about whether we properly respect truth. And if there's anything that really galls me, is to see Christians mess around with studies and with pretend activity that does not truly quest for truth. We are a people that are committed to truth. Our God is a God of truth. Our responsibilities are truth-seeking. We cannot waste our time messing around with stuff that just answers silly questions about how many, and is that number growing or is it not growing. Some of that may be of interest to people, but it does not suggest anything about the frontier. Science is involved in the precise handling of data. And whether it's counting and statistical analysis or whether it's just careful observation. For example, Jean Piaget on the streets of Geneva with the children. He is engaged in a very precise form of handling the information that he is seeing. Now, he is not a quantitative researcher. At this point, he is a qualitative researcher, and out of what he sees, he observes carefully, he documents neatly and cleanly, and he builds a body of content which grounds theory. Now then, the grounding of theory is where science moves into art. Because the modes by which we handle those data, the cleverness within which we stay faithful to scientific principle and still extend the uses of data so that we're able to put numbers together, or put ideas together and build them into whole constructs. There is the place where art comes in. And the most effective science coupled to the most effective art, is that magic combination that is represented in the best of researchers. And it's rare that the researcher can answer the question, are you scientist or are you artist? And many would argue, and I would encourage them to do so, I'm both. There's where we have the task of training people at the PhD level to be both artists and scientists, to handle data precisely, but to work with it creatively